Hey, hey. That was exciting. Good morning, and welcome to HTTP 1 Must Die. Have you ever had a good thing that went a bit too far? Maybe you got more than you bargained for. This is the 4th year I've spent researching desync attacks, and so I thought I knew what I was going to find. The plan was to neatly wrap up a well-understood attack class with some weird bugs and niche flaws on exotic targets. The long tail of HTTP desync attacks. But what I actually found changed both my perspective and the title of this presentation. So today, in this session, I'll share tools and techniques to enable you to embrace the never-ending horror of HTTP 1.1, navigate the Desync Endgame, and convince the rest of the world that it is time for HTTP 1 to die. This started back in 2019 when I realized that H1 has a fatal flaw. The isolation between individual HTTP requests is fundamentally broken. There's no single reliable way to tell where one request finishes and the next request begins, which means an attacker who finds the tiniest parser discrepancy between a front-end and back-end server can cause a desync, which usually enables complete site takeover. And what with HTTP 1 being an old, lenient text-based protocol with thousands of different implementations, finding parser discrepancies back then was not hard at all. At the time, it felt like using just this one technique, you could hack pretty much any website you wanted to. For example, I was able to use it to get persistent control of the JavaScript on PayPal's login page twice, just with that technique. But we knew what the solution was. If we deployed H2 for the upstream connection between the front-end and back-end server, it would basically eliminate the entire attack class. So, 6 years later, what's actually happened? Well, unsurprisingly, the industry hasn't done that. They have started using H2 for the connection between the browser, the client, and the front-end server, but then they generally just downgrade those requests to H1 to talk to the back-end server, which actually makes the desync situation even worse. And then, because yes, things were getting hacked, they decided to bolt on the ultimate security measure known as regular expressions. The result is a mess. Here's a classic desync detection probe. You send 2 requests, and if the target is vulnerable, the first one poisons the connection to the backend, prefixing the second request with the text shown in orange and causing the robots.txt response shown there. Now, if you try this technique on a modern target, chances are it will fail even if the target is really vulnerable. That's because it'll get blocked by multiple regular expressions on the front end, or the robots.txt gadget might not work on that endpoint, and people are using a tiny number of gadgets. And there's also just inherent race conditions, which means this approach is really unreliable for that reason too. And if you use strategies which do exist to avoid the race conditions, then you get even more heavily blocked by regular expressions. So basically, over the last 6 years, the industry has patched the detection methodology. They've patched the scanning tools, but they haven't patched the actual vulnerability. This has created what I call the Desync Endgame, where everything looks secure until you make the tiniest change to your testing strategy. Let's take a look at an example. A few months ago, I got an email from Vance saying he'd found a puzzling vulnerability and would like to know my thoughts about what was happening. The attack was a completely normal desync. You send a request like this, it gets downgraded to H1, and it poisons the connection to the back end, so the next person to try to visit the target website gets redirected to his web server. And thanks to caching, that redirection could get saved, so we could redirect JavaScript files to malicious JavaScript files and get persistent permanent takeover of probably every page on the site. And this was all just working absolutely fine, except for one small thing, which is that when he ran this attack on that website, the users that were being hijacked weren't actually trying to access the target website. It was somehow redirecting people by compromising random third-party sites, including things like banks. So clearly, the server setup doesn't look like this. And after having a quick look at the target, I thought, okay, well, this must be a desync between the Cloudflare front end and Heroku's reverse proxy. So maybe we're exploiting random websites hosted on Heroku. But this was actually completely wrong as well. I discovered this when I set out to replicate his attack for myself. Because I looked at the attack and I sent it and I went, hang on, he's made a mistake there. This request has been blocked by Cloudflare's front-end cache. So this request has never left Cloudflare's infrastructure. So there's no way this is an issue with Heroku. And I thought, oh, this is just a bug. He's made a mistake here. And I corrected his mistake by adding a cache buster. And that made the technique stop working. So what does that mean exactly? Well, that means, right, Heroku has nothing to do with this. There was a period of time during which if you tested a website for request smuggling with H2 like this and you did it correctly, you did it the way following the exact methodology, you would find nothing. But if you happened to hit a static file with a GET request and forgot to specify a cache buster, well then, you would be causing a desync inside Cloudflare's own infrastructure, enabling you to persistently compromise almost every single website using Cloudflare. This is the Desync Endgame. Things look like they're secure, but you do one thing differently, and you end up hacking 24 million websites in one go. How do bugs like that even happen? Partly, it's the sheer complexity of the systems involved. For example here, Cloudflare actually supports upstream H2, so we can infer they're receiving the request over H2, converting it to HTTP1 for internal use, and then converting it back to H2 again for the upstream connection, which is insane. But the core of the problem is the foundation. It's HTTP1. There's this idea that HTTP1 is a simple protocol and that makes it secure. But in reality, as soon as you start proxying HTTP1, it gets extremely complex. To illustrate that, here's 5 lies that I used to personally believe about HTTP 1.1. And every one of these is going to be used for an exploit in this presentation. When combined, the last 3 lies here mean that if you've got a reverse proxy, it needs state just to read the correct number of bytes off the socket from the back-end trusted server. And it needs special casing just to successfully read in the headers and know where the body even starts in that byte stream. And the entire response may actually arrive before you've even finished receiving the request from the client. This is HTTP1. It's the foundation of the web. It's made of landmines that routinely expose millions of websites, and we've spent 6 years failing to fix it. It needs to die. So, how do we kill it? We do that by collectively showing the world that upstream HTTP1 is insecure, that more desync attacks are always around the corner. And in the rest of the session, I'll show you how to do that. First, I'll introduce a new toolkit to handle the Desync Endgame. Then I'll share 2 entire new classes of desync attack, exposing millions more websites. And then I'll take a focused look at whether H2 is a worthy successor and wrap up with a Q&A. During this presentation, I'll be following the research journey. So We're going to start out gaining knowledge, but not getting paid very much by way of bug bounties. But as that knowledge takes us further beyond the state of the art, things are going to rapidly get a lot more profitable. All bounties referenced in this presentation were split equally between everyone involved, and 100% of my cut has been matched by Portswigger and donated to a local mental health charity. So, to win at the end game, what we need to start is a reliable way to find parser discrepancies. And back in 2021, in a presentation at Black Hat Europe, Daniel Thatcher gave us one and published an accompanying tool. And I was so hyped by this presentation, I took the concept and expanded on it this year to make my own extra powerful tool from scratch. And this is now fully integrated into HB Request Smuggler version 3. This is an open source Burp Suite extension fully compatible with the free version, and it uses a broad range of techniques to analyze and classify how the target front end and back end are parsing the request and find discrepancies. So let's just take a look at a few examples. On this live target, by looking at the status codes, we can see that if we use a space to mask a host header, then we get a unique result from the server, which is different to what we see if we just leave out the host header entirely, or if we just send the host header without any obfuscation. And from those responses there, we can infer that we found a parser discrepancy. This particular one is called a visible hidden discrepancy because the mask header is visible to the front end but hidden from the back end. And these are usually quite straightforward to turn into a CL0 desync simply by hiding the content length header as shown here. Crucially though, if you run into any issues when you're trying to build this exploit, you can just adapt and deal with them because you know the underlying flaw. For example, on a different target, they were rejecting GET requests that had a body, but because I already knew the discrepancy, I was able to work around that by trying a few different things and eventually finding that using the options method resolved the issue. So that's what makes this approach so valuable. And then it combines loads of different headers and permutations and strategies, so it gets really nice coverage overall. For example, on this target, we're still using the host header, and we're still using a leading space to hide that header, but this time we're sending a duplicate host header with a malformed value, and this has found a desync on a web VPN used by a bank. In general, just a side note, web VPNs basically all have custom terrible HTTP stacks, so if you've got a web VPN, just don't put a proxy in front of it. This system even lets you predict vulnerabilities. So the RFC says you can accept a /n by itself on as a line terminator. And the scanner found this system, which is not doing that. So that means if this system was to be placed behind a reverse proxy, then you could cause a disagreement about where the body of the request starts and cause a desync. And obviously now that server wasn't behind a reverse proxy, so that server wasn't exploitable, but we traced the issue back to the HTTP library that the server was using, and that is widely used. Unfortunately, they haven't yet patched it, but I imagine that will be coming out fairly soon now. The tool also flagged a whole lot of systems running Microsoft IIS behind Amazon's application load balancer. And as we can see from the server banners here, this discrepancy is happening the opposite way round. So it's the front end that doesn't see the header and the back end that sees it. It's a hidden, visible discrepancy. These targets are lightly protected by AWS's Desync Guardian, which has a lot of regexes and is a bit of a headache when you're trying to do exploitation. So when I saw that, I thought, you know what, I'll park this, I'll put it on the shelf, and I'll come back to it later. And while it sat on my shelf gathering dust, Thomas Stacey independently discovered the same discrepancy and came up with a bypass for Desync Guardian using the single packet attack. So he was able to exploit those systems. And the interesting thing is that AWS didn't respond by patching the discrepancy. They only patched Desync Guardian. So what that means is that even now, these systems are still vulnerable to header injection, which can have a really serious impact in the right situation. If you want to secure yourself against that, you need to change a couple of settings on your load balancer. When I saw that, I said to AWS, you've literally got settings that mitigate this vulnerability. Why don't you turn them on by default? And their answer was that, well, unfortunately, lots of people use application load balancer, and some of those people have ancient HTTP clients which rely on sending malformed HTTP requests. So they can't make your system secure by default because it would make someone else's system break. Basically, when you use a cloud proxy, you're importing other people's technical debt into your own infrastructure. This finding is where things started to really get interesting. I'm absolutely gutted I can't name this target. They were very explicit that I couldn't name them because I'm going to be talking about this target for the next 10 minutes. So this finding, it's another hidden visible. And the obvious exploit for a hidden visible is to hide the transfer encoding chunked header from the front end, but they had a WAF or something that was blocking those attempts. So it forced me to ask the question, how do you exploit this? How do you exploit a hidden visible without transfer encoding? Well, what happens if you smuggle a content length header on this setup? That would be a 0CL desync, and this is something that was widely regarded as impossible. I even said it was impossible myself. That's because the front end, when the front end misses the content length header, that means it only forwards the headers to the backend server because it thinks there is no body. And then the backend server just times out while waiting for the body to arrive, which then kills the connection. In other words, as soon as you try a 0CL desync attack, you get a server-side connection deadlock, which is great if you just want to take the server down, but not so useful for getting actual desync attacks. But last year, while researching timing attacks, I stumbled on a solution by accident. I found that whenever I timed how long it would take to load a static file served by Nginx, I would get a negative response timestamp because Nginx was responding to me before I'd even finished sending my request. This was a nuisance in the context of timing attacks, but it showed me that sometimes servers do respond to incomplete requests, which is something that would let us escape this deadlock. However, that target wasn't running Nginx, it was running IIS. So, how do you make IIS respond early? Well, documentation is a wonderful thing, and this is a beautiful example of why. On Windows, Microsoft tells you, do not use any of these words to refer to a file or folder name because the operating system will think you're trying to access a device driver and then blow up. So, what happens if we do this? Well, it turns out on Nginx, that makes you on IIS, you hit a special code path, which means that they respond early without waiting for the body, and thereby this lets us escape the deadlock. That means that when the next request hits the server, the backend incorrectly chops some data off the start of it, and you'll probably see a response that says 400 bad request. Seeing this response happen was quite an emotional moment for me for two reasons. Firstly, I'd known about that device driver weirdness for over 10 years, and I always felt this looked suspicious, but I was never able to actually make use of the technique until now. Secondly, over the last 6 years of desync research, I'd seen so many inexplicable bad request responses that I actually made HTTP Request Smuggler report these as mystery 400 findings, and this is the point when I realized they were probably all exploitable 0CL desyncs. So the first step, if you want to do a 0CL, is to find an early response gadget, like that one on IIS. It's really easy on Nginx. The main well-known server that I've looked at where I haven't been able to find one is Apache. So if you find an early response gadget on Apache, I would absolutely love to hear about it. Now we know what's happening, we can start to move towards something that's actually useful as an exploit. So if you nest the second request line inside the header block of the second request and adjust the content length of the first request, then you can slice out everything before that and get a response as shown here. Now, this proves that there's a 0CL desync, but it's not really a realistic attack because our victim is not going to coincidentally have a payload to exploit themselves inside their own request. For a high-quality exploit, what we really need is a way to add our payload into their request rather than just chopping bits off. We can achieve this with a double desync. This is where things start to get a bit complex. This is a two-stage attack. So the first request causes a 0CL desync that therefore weaponizes the second request to cause a CL0 desync that therefore means the third request that comes from our victim actually gets exploited. Now, the cleanest conceptual way to do this is for the stage 1 payload to chop all the headers of the stage 2 payload as shown here. But in practice, this very rarely actually works. That's because front ends have a very annoying habit of injecting additional HTTP headers. And this makes all your length calculations incorrect and breaks the attack. I've released a script which will brute force the length of the injected header and make things kind of work, but it's still not very good in practice because these injected headers often contain values like your IP address. So what that means is you'll have a 100% reliable proof of concept, and then you'll give it to someone else. And because their IP address happens to be a different length, it will never, ever work. So it creates a replication nightmare. Fortunately, there is a better way, because virtually all servers, when they inject headers, they put them at the end of the header block. So if our payload can start before that, our attack, although it's now kind of ugly, will be much more reliable. In this example here, I'm chaining the desync with an input reflection feature on the site in order to reveal that the injected header's value is accept encoding identity. But once I'd figured that out, it was pretty easy to combine it with the head technique in order to serve malicious JavaScript to random live users on the site. The only other remaining hitch was that there was some kind of race condition involved in this, so it only worked if you sent at least a few hundred requests per second. In general, I would say if you're having trouble replicating a desync issue, sending requests faster may just solve the problem. Now, things got quite involved there, but the good news is we have published a Web Security Academy lab, so you can practice that whole chain yourself on a test system for free. And also there is a live stream on YouTube of me eventually successfully solving that lab, which you can watch as well. Now, we were able to exploit a decent number of targets with this technique, with the best payout coming from XNES and some more on the way, I believe. The only other thing to note here is that most of these targets were vulnerable because they were using a particular web application firewall which was introducing the vulnerability. So if they weren't using a web application firewall, they would have actually been significantly harder to hack. Now, at this point, I thought, great, I'm finally done. We're done. The desync threat is fully mapped, and any future issues are going to be weird niche flaws rather than big class breaks. And that is a mistake that I make every single year without fail. It took the next discovery for me to finally realize the truth, which is that more desync attacks at scale are always coming. Back in 2022, I tried out causing desyncs with the expect header, and I didn't find anything. But as it turns out, I wasn't looking close enough. The first clue this time round that the expect header is something special is that adding support for it to my HTTP client Turbo Intruder added a ton of complexity to a critical part of the code. And that's just a HTTP client. And everything is always worse for proxies, and complexity in HTTP 1 means danger. Expect is intended to break sending a request into a two-part process so that clients can save bandwidth by bailing early. That's how old this feature is. But it's in the RFC, so everyone supports it, even though no web browsers actually use it. What it does in practice is it introduces statefulness into a whole area of the code that previously didn't need it, and therefore raises lots of nasty edge cases. And you can see this in many different ways on many live websites. For example, on this well-known site, if you send a head request, that's a special case, but that works just fine. If you send the expect header, that works just fine. But if you combine those two things, then they forget that it's a head request, which means they try to read too many bytes off the response from the back end, and you get a server-side deadlock, and the server goes down. And that's a kind of mild flaw as far as expect is concerned. For example, on some targets, you send expect, and they just dump server-side memory, including things like secret keys. When I went to report that one, I found, unfortunately, they'd shut down their bounty program, which was sad. Also, because expect triggers two response header blocks, it often breaks attempts to remove sensitive response headers. So, for example, on everything on the Netlify CDN, if you send an expect header, you suddenly get a whole ton of nice debugging headers coming back to you, which you may find useful. When I reported that to Netlify, they said, actually, that's a feature, but they did pay me for it anyway, which was a bit weird. Now, around this time, I got a message from a small team of full-time bounty hunters who had also noticed that the expect header was making interesting things happen. And this made me panic slightly because, in general, a research collision is not good news. But I'd already heard of these guys because of their research on T0 request smuggling, which landed third in the top 10 web hacking techniques of 2024. And I figured, you know what? Since they know what they're doing, and they already know this technique, we might as well team up, because hopefully with my help, with their help, I'll get more case studies, and ideally with my help, they'll make more money. Let's see what happened. We immediately found that just sending a normal expect header causes a 0CL desync on a whole lot of targets, including some that pay really quite well. I think this is caused by a bug where when the front-end server receives the response from the back-end, it forgets that it hasn't yet received the body from the client, so it treats that as a separate request. Now, I chose this particular example because it was a great interaction. T-Mobile gave us a $12,000 payout, even though this only affected a single pre-production server. So I'll definitely be looking quite closely at their domains in future. This example is a similar technique, but there's a couple of interesting things that are different. Firstly, the attack only works if you obfuscate the expect header value by adding a single extra character. It's really advanced stuff here. And secondly, this domain holds the attachments to the 0-day vulnerability reports sent to GitLab's bug bounty program. Sorry, GitLab's bug bounty program. So wouldn't it be nice to get our hands on some of those? Now, on this target, we opted to go for response queue poisoning. It shouldn't necessarily be the first thing you try because it has side effects, but it's a truly glorious attack which results in the server sending everyone random responses intended for other users. And it can be hard on low traffic servers like this one, but we persisted, and after 27,000 requests, we got access to someone else's private vulnerability report and a respectable $7,000 payout off GitLab, plus some really nice payouts from other places that I can't talk about. The expect header also causes CL0 desync, such as this one, which gave us response queue poisoning on the entire Netlify CDN. So this time, the impact was even bigger because we were hijacking a continuous stream of responses from everyone on the entire CDN, which I think is still over 1 million websites. Now, we found this on a particular Netlify client that had their own bounty program, but it didn't make sense to report it to them because we were hijacking responses. They were all coming from third-party sites. And also, it mysteriously stopped working shortly after we found it. So we reported it to Netlify with all the evidence, and they said, because you found this by looking at a website out of scope of our own program, even though it affects literally 100% of our customers, we're not going to pay you for it, which was a bit disappointing. Normally, when I have a bad bounty experience, I don't talk about it in conferences because the drama and excitement distracts people from the technical content that I think people should be paying attention to, but this one is useful context for a decision that we're going to make in a couple of slides' time. This is the last desync attack in this presentation, and it's a very special one. Here it's giving us full control over auth.lastpass.com and netting us their maximum bounty because it let us serve content from entirely different websites on their domain. But there was more to it. This technique worked on a lot of websites. There's a few select websites where if you find you can hack them, you know you're onto something good. And with this technique, there was significant evidence that we could have used it to exploit example.com. This would have been super cool because I bet they get a lot of really interesting traffic from around the world. Unfortunately, they don't have a bounty program or a VDP, so it would have been illegal for me to establish whether this was actually possible or not, and we will never know for sure. But I'm going to try to persuade them to set one up in case this happens again. Most of the vulnerable targets were using the Akamai CDN. So this meant we actually had a choice about how to report this issue. We could report it to affected companies directly, or we could report it to Akamai only. And if they were to react the same way as Netlify, not get paid. So you can probably guess which option was more appealing. It was actually a tricky decision for me because I really value having a good long-term relationship with the CDN wherever possible. But when I collaborate with bounty hunters, I want them to make more money as a result of working with me, not less. So in the end, I said, you would have discovered this issue without me. So I'll just sit this one out. It's your finding, you report it, don't put me on the report, and I won't take a cut of the bounties, which is a decision that I have mixed feelings about to this day because they went on to earn over $200,000 from this issue. Now, these reports were well received, but things didn't go entirely smoothly. It turned out this vulnerability was fully inside Akamai's infrastructure, and so Akamai got flooded with support tickets from the clients. I became concerned about the issue potentially leaking out and getting exploited in the wild, so I contacted Akamai to help them patch it faster and got a $9,000 bounty for that. And they got a kind of a partial hotfix out quite fast, but it still took 65 days from that point to fully resolve all variants of the vulnerability. Overall, this experience was quite stressful for me, but I got some good dollar-backed evidence of the harm posed by HTTP1 because it took the total earned in this research to slightly over $350,000. So, defense. All the attacks in this entire presentation have been exploiting implementation bugs. So it may seem weird for me to be saying we need to delete and disable and ban the protocol. But the reason I came to that conclusion is that all of these attacks come from the same single protocol flaw, which is that there is no well-defined way of identifying the length of a message. And that's combined by two key factors, which are that HTTP1 is not simple if you're proxying it, and thanks to legacy clients, the approaches that we could make to patch this issue that would actually work, we're too scared of taking because they will break things. All these factors combine to mean exactly one thing, which is that more desync attacks are coming. To escape, we need to use HTTP 2 or 3. This protocol is not perfect by any means, but it has zero ambiguity about where each request stops and the next one starts. So although it is really quite complex and there will be implementation bugs, these are mostly much lower impact, with obviously the occasional interesting exception. So using upstream HTTP2 is how you fix this. You make sure your origin server supports H2, which it probably already does, and then you turn on upstream H2 on the front end, and the protocol will take care of everything else for you. Note that you don't have to turn off HTTP1 on the client side. You can still support things that only talk HTTP1. You just need to make sure that you rewrite those requests as H2 when talking to the upstream. The reason H1 is less dangerous on the client side is because those connections are not usually shared in between different users. Now, if you happen to be on Nginx or Akamai or CloudFront or Fastly, you can't actually do this. You can't turn on upstream H1 yet. So here are some short-term mitigations that you can use to try and dodge most of the incoming damage coming towards your website. But please understand, these are just short-term sticking plasters. The only way to use H1 and be completely safe from desync attacks is not to have a front-end server. Now, if you work in the offense space, I really need your help, because the number one problem that we've got is that people think upstream H1 is secure. But together, we can show the world the truth. We can take these techniques, we can break them, get them fixed, and share our findings with the message that more desync attacks are on the way. To have the most success in this area, right now, you can take the off-the-shelf tools and you will find some nice bugs. But there's going to be a new wave of regexes which is going to stop those tools from working as well. So what you need to do is take them and tweak them, make small adjustments to them, try novel concepts, and you will have some very nice findings. I first gave this presentation about a month ago, and since then, some people have shown me some stuff they've found, partly using this research, and there's some very nice stuff out there waiting for you to discover it. For me, one key question with further research is, what's the next expect? What other features in H1 have serious desync potential? And this is worth looking at, but another cool thing about H1 is it's so poorly understood. No one even reads these RFCs, and that means there's tons to find even beyond the realm of desync attacks. For example, it's well known that you can use the trace method to leak internal headers if the backend supports it. But what if the backend server has trace turned off? Does that mean they're secure against this technique? Well, actually no, because there's an obscure HTTP header called max forwards. And this lets you request that any server in the entire chain execute your request instead of the backend. So that way you can exploit a misconfigured piece of middleware instead, and potentially find some nice juicy headers. HTTP1 remains an absolute goldmine for research. There's a lot of further reading available, including a full white paper and a lab. You can find everything you need linked from http1mustdie.com. And the three key things to take away are that this is not the end. More desync attacks are always coming. So if we want a secure web, HTTP1 needs to die. And it won't be easy, but if we work together, we can kill it. I'll take 5 minutes of questions now. If you have any more after that, I'll be around the conference all day. Just grab me and ask me, or just send me an email. Don't forget to follow me on social media. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, James. It was an awesome talk. Thank you very much. So we have quite a few questions. I don't know if I'm going to be shown here, but
Cool.
I can just read them. So the first one, do you think the SNI and APLN might be an interesting to look into to find new bug classes related to Desync or alike?
Yes, definitely. The SNI field especially is somewhere that is massively overlooked. We recently put support for customizing the SNI into Burp Suite in the repeater, so you can send custom payloads there. And it's definitely somewhere that's historically been overlooked. Basically, when tools don't expose the ability to do and attack, very few people try it. So it's definitely worth looking at.
All right, thank you. So next question. This is more methodology, more than technique. So how do you usually how do you deal with dead end in your research? How do you decide if it's better to give up or persist?
So knowing whether to stop or continue is one of the most difficult challenges in research. The main part of it's kind of intuition and hard to explain. But one key strategy is I plan things in advance. I say I'm going to spend one week, and within that 1 week, I need some kind of lead, like some kind of intuition, some kind of proof that this is viable. And then I try to get that as early as possible.
Okay, thank you. And I will ask one last question. Are you usually researching on prod targets, or are you setting labs where you have full observability? If the latter, have you ever tried to use a feedback-based fuzzer?
So far, I've basically exclusively researched on production systems. I have a Burp project file with 30,000 bug bounty sites in it, and I just throw payloads at all of these sites, and I see what happens. That's what enables me to find the completely crazy stuff, like that memory leak, that kind of scope of targets, or desyncs inside like CDN's own infrastructure. A bunch of these issues basically only exist in prod, so that's the best place to look for them.
Okay, thank you very much.